By way of introduction, I'm Keith Darcy. I've been around this ethics world for a long time, but let me kind of take a trip backwards a little bit to tell you how accidentally I stepped into this world. Probably three strains that are worth mentioning in this. I've had three parallel careers. One has been in business, especially in the financial services industry. I'll come back to that in a second. Did about 40 years in it. I ran three financial service companies, a bank, an insurance company, and a derivatives trading company. And when I retired some 20 years ago, I joined the board of two national banks. So I've had C-suite and governing authority experiences, which were very valuable to me as we went forward. I've also been an educator for over 45 years. I used to teach nights and weekends, full semester courses. For 10 years, I taught economics and finance, both undergraduate and graduate. And then I began to realize that more and more of my finance class was time being spent on scandals, as I brought in newspapers to kind of talk to the student population. And that began to pique my interest. Along with my banking career, I was seeing more and more frauds being perpetrated against banks and other things. So about 38 years ago, I turned my teaching interest to ethics and leadership, and a lot of it being self-taught. I am passionate about this field, and so that has filled me greatly over the years. And because of that, it ultimately, and I'll get to the place where the turning points come in, but it ultimately turned into not just an avocational interest, but a vocational interest, one in which I quit my career in banking to full-time be in the ethics world, whatever that meant, and I wasn't quite sure about that. So let me go back to the banking piece. There's a third strain in here, by the way, which I think is important to note too, which is personal. And I grew up in a very dysfunctional family, heavy alcoholism in the family. I was the rescuer. I'm trained as a rescuer. I took people to AA meetings, dry out clinics, psychiatrists, up to the point that nobody wanted to be saved. And I ultimately learned painfully that the only sane thing to do was to save myself. So I literally had to step away from the dysfunctions of this family, and that began a very personal journey in search of self and so forth. And I'd love to tell you how easy it was, and it was not. It was a very difficult and painful journey. But when you can't save a family, I decided I was going to do the next best thing, which is save the world. Now, that's a very big task. You need lots of planning, lots of resources, and so forth. But in this time, I began to get involved in politics avocationally at a fairly high level, thinking that maybe, working in the political arena, we could contribute to a better society. And so I tried that for about 3 years, again, very high level. Saw too much money and too much corruption and too many conflicts of interest. And within 3 years, I decided I had to back out of that world. Our values were absolutely not aligned whatsoever. At some point in time, my parents died in the mid-1980s. I considered that my midlife crisis. We were fully estranged at the time. But it begins to raise questions about one's own mortality. And just by way of background, at age 10, I was run over by a taxi cab, hit and run, spent 6 months in Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. So the notion of mortality, the limitation of life, that we're only here for a minute in life, what is it that you want to contribute? What, do I want to be a banker just like Dad? Or did I want to take a different route? So in the midst of this midlife crisis, I came home one day, and I said to my wife, honey, I'm 37 years old and I can do anything I want. She said, well, what is it you want to do? I said, I want to go back to school, get a master's degree. She said, but you got an MBA 15 years ago. What are you talking about? I said, I want to go to New York Theological Seminary and kind of really find out what it is that I believe in. So I was a senior executive at HSBC by day. I was a seminarian nights and weekends for the next 2 years, and 60 credits later, it was a totally transforming experience. I remember the first day I went to class. I had told a couple of friends of mine that I was going to go to seminary, and they looked at me cross-eyed, like, are you going off the rails here? Your parents just died, blah, blah, blah. I said, no, I don't think so. But I stopped telling any friends that I was going to seminary. So I go to class the first night. I come up from Wall Street. I'm dressed in my pinstripe suit, my stripe tie, my Johnston & Murphy shoes. I'm clearly, as I look at my now future classmates, the only one that lives on Wall Street and in the affluent suburbs. Everybody else looks like they're already ordained ministers or whatever it may be. It was a Master's of Divinity degree that I was enrolled in. So my heart is pounding. I'm thinking that this is probably the dumbest idea I've ever gotten myself into. So I sit in the back of the room right near the door. And if I don't like it and it doesn't like me, I'm out of here. And so literally my heart's pounding. It's like crazy. So the professor walks into the room and he has a book in his hand and he doesn't say anything. He doesn't introduce himself. He sits down at the desk in the front and he waits until the quiet fills the room. Everybody was talking. He just waited until everybody finished their conversation. And then he opened the book and he began to read. And he read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void." And I have to tell you, and I still get goosebumps when I hear it, because I knew for me, when I heard those first words, "in the beginning," that it was absolutely a new beginning for me. And the next 2 years were just the most transforming. So I not only got to study the scriptures in full, but it also opened me up to begin to study Eastern philosophies, great poets and other great thought leaders of all kinds during this period of time. I was drinking through a fire hose of all of this information. And clearly what was emerging was my sense of values being more fully articulated. And I could see a vision, however modest it was at that time, that maybe my teaching career and my business career could come together and be a force for good in business. Maybe, just maybe. I took my wife and kids on a trip to the Holy Land with classmates and faculty, and it was, again, another transforming experience. And I remember we were going to end our journey coming into Jerusalem, and the thought of that was not lost on me. And so the day before we were about to leave, we were brought through the garden of Joseph of Arimathea. We go to Golgotha, the place of the skull where the crucifixion is believed to have taken place, and then we come to the tomb. And I realized at this moment, this is why I'm here. I have to discover this. So I didn't want to be the first one in and be crowded out by others. I wanted to be the last so I could really savor this experience. And so a few people come in, a few people come out, a few go in, a few come out. And this classmate of mine and her mother go in, and they come out. And the mother, in a disappointed voice, turned to her daughter and said, "There's nothing there." And I went into the hole in this mountain laughing, because I realized everything I was ever looking for in life was in there. It was in the hole of the mountain. And metaphorically, it was never out there. It was never the external things that I was reaching for. Success, money, happiness, prestige, whatever it may be. It was always in here. It was always in here. So we come home from the trip, and I turned to my wife, and I said, "Honey, I'm 39 years old, and I can do anything I want." She says, "What now?" And I said, "I want to quit my career in banking and start a foundation to promote ethics and leadership." So that was the turning point there, although there are many other turning points in this journey. But having said this, I go to the bank. The bank says to me, "We don't want you to leave. If you stay for a year, we'll pay you for another year." Well, I figured I just got 2 years of financial headwinds for me to start a foundation. I go and I tell an attorney friend of mine who's in the trust and estate business of my plan now, because I'm definitely going forward. And he says, "I've got somebody you have to meet. His name is Joseph Harry Snyder. He's a client of mine, and he's dying of brain cancer. You got to meet him." So I go to this guy's apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and in his broken mind, he's had several surgeries, he explains to me that he had just started this foundation to promote ethics and leadership, but clearly would not be able to take that journey. And I explained to him the modest vision that I had, and I finally said to Joe after about an hour, I said, "Joe, I may have just become your miracle, and you may have just become mine." He left me a corpus of $1 million to get started. We did not ultimately succeed. I did some wonderful things during the next several years with this foundation, ran conferences, did a whole bunch of things, met other people in the ethics profession, Jeff Kaplan, Joe Murphy, who I know you've got on camera as well, but reached a point where it was not going to succeed. We did hold a major conference, though. On my board of directors were people like John Whitehead, the former co-CEO at Goldman Sachs, among other luminaries. John and I used to talk extensively about ethics. And I remember he would even say to me, he said, I fear the day that Goldman goes public, because it was a partnership at that point in time. He said, the culture of this firm will change. And it was obvious that it would. But we had some great conversations. A conference that we held, we had 300 people come out for it, the leaders of academia, business, government, et cetera. The keynote speaker that day was somebody who I'd met a few years before, Roger Beaujolais, who was the chief stress analyst on the Wharton Challenger project. And he was the guy who wanted to shut down the project. He had talked about how in the cold temperatures, as they were testing these missiles going up, that as the temperatures dropped, the O-ring would separate from the fuselage, and that the previous flight, before the Challenger last flight was to go up, there was a 14-foot blow-by, as he called it. And so he was quite convinced that the lower the temperature, the greater the threat of loss of life. Well, he got up to speak about this thing, and you know, at lunch you hear the clinking of the plates. I still have the tape at home listening to it, and then you hear everybody just go silent, because like the engineer that he was trying to talk nothing but facts, but in between each of the facts you could feel the emotion coming out of his pores. I mean, it was just stunning. I get goosebumps just thinking about it. He wanted to shut the project down, convened a conference call the night before the flight went up. The temperature was going to be 18 degrees the morning of the flight. Everybody said, nope, flight's got to go. Unbeknownst to most people, Ronald Reagan was going to speak to Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space, from the State of the Union message in the Congress. And the White House didn't order them to put this thing up in the air, but nobody was willing to go back to the White House and say, you know, we're going to shut the flight down. You can't speak to Krista McAuliffe in space. Joe and I maintained a relationship for several years, talked about writing a book together. I said, first half of the book, write about Challenger, and then I'll talk about the other similar scandals and issues that were related to this. Net result, we never got around to that book project. He never got to write the book that he wanted, but he was a fine man, but he suffered greatly from that. He really did. So, thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
The whistle after the sixth launch, and people ignored it. So
That's right.
It was just normal. Quote,
Yeah.
unquote.
Oh, it was awful, just awful. But
the scary sentence was, take your engineer hat off and put your management hat on.
That's right. Yeah, that was the sentence. You're absolutely right. That's, boy, I felt so bad for that guy. And he was not going to watch the flight that day. You know, they have a big screen, a room, and so forth. He was going to walk away. I mean, he really didn't think that thing was going to fly. One of his buddies said, come on in. He sat on the floor in front of the big screen, and 75 seconds later, it was over. I mean, it's unthinkable. But so here I am on this ethics journey. I have now a foundation that is not being able to sustain itself. I understood that. We still had some money in the bank, but it was clear that I couldn't raise enough additional money. I thought I needed to get to $2.5 million. And you know, we were spending down hosting conferences for free and getting people into the conversation. And this was at a time, too, before the federal sentencing guidelines, where there was no mandate for this. So there was some lip service to ethics in the late 1980s and the very early 1990s. And I had a few consulting projects that I did for major corporations, particularly around culture, which was interesting. But there was no mandate for companies to engage and build a sophisticated, organized ethics and compliance program. So I finally reached the point that I was also appearing to build something redundant to the Center for Business Ethics. So I took the remaining assets of the foundation and I donated them to the center. And I gave Joe Snyder's library of 1,500 books to Bentley University and decided, okay, I'm going to move on from here. As it turns out, I get a call from Prudential Securities. We have a $2 billion scandal on our hands. We need somebody to come in and build the first ethics office on Wall Street. Would you join us? I said, sure, you know, let's go to it. So I joined Prudential, an organization that we had been talking about up in the Boston area, the Ethics Officer Association, later renamed Ethics and Compliance Officer Association. There was a group of people, myself included, talking about bringing a cross-sector membership organization together for ethics and compliance executives. kind of modeled after the Defense Industry Initiative. You know, that was a very singular focused industry. We were talking about a cross-industry initiative. They decided only practitioners could be members of the ECOA, as it became known for many years. And I was not yet a practitioner, but all of a sudden Prue calls me up and says, we want you to be vice president and build the first ethics office on Wall Street under a federal monitor. I said, great. So I called Mike Hoffman. I said, I'm ready to join. So I became member number 39 of the ECOA, not realizing that many years later, Gretchen Winter would call me up one day and say, hey, would you come up here and consider being the new executive director for the association? So long story short, spent 2.5, 3 years at Prue. We whacked 2,000 people. That's an HR term. A lot of bad actors that we had to get rid of and so forth. Did a lot of things to turn the culture around. Felt very positive about it. I didn't believe it was going to be a career move for me, though. So while I grew up in the banking business and I was very comfortable with the risks and threats to conventional banking, this was a broker-dealer. And it's very different. Not having grown up in the bank, I was licensed. I went out and got a securities license, but I didn't have the complete instinct for risk in this particular business as I did in banking. But then one day, somebody, the head of HR, came to me and he said, the vice chairman for risk management who you report to is retiring, so we're going to transfer the ethics function to the senior vice president for public affairs. I said, not on my watch. I said, my reputation is not for that. You're the most unethical firm on Wall Street, even though you've made a turnaround, and now you're going to put this into public affairs and market this? Not going to happen. So I was about to leave. He comes back to me an hour later. He says, the chairman says he'll double your compensation if you stay. I said, no, I'm going to be out of here. As it turns out, I get a call from Georgetown University at the same time. They're looking for an associate dean and a distinguished professor of business ethics. I thought I died and went to heaven. I used to tease people during my teaching career that at age 50, I'm going to quit my career in banking. I'm going to become a full-time professor and tennis coach at a university someplace. Well, Georgetown didn't offer me the tennis coach job, but I thought this was going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. So down to DC I go. Long story short, ultimately learned I didn't like the academy as much full-time as I liked it part-time. You know, there was a lot of administrivia. Decision-making is not even glacial. It's often non-existent. I come out of a Wall Street environment where we make decisions on the dime. I love teaching the kids, but there were other factors that just left me not feeling great about this experience. And I had a friend of mine who is now CEO. I worked with him for many years, now CEO of a bank down on Wall Street. And he had a son at Georgetown. And every couple of months he'd come down and have lunch with his son. He'd want to see me. Would you come up and work with me? Would you come up with work with me? So one day my wife and I are out to dinner on M Street. She turns to me. She says, you're not happy here, are you? And I said, no, I'm not. She said, do you want to go home? And I said, yeah, I do. And I think about the sacrifices that she made in supporting me unconditionally. I mean, it was one of those moments. So I let go of Georgetown, came up to Wall Street. I was appointed senior vice president in charge of human resources, even though I had no human resources background, but I had strategic background and banking background. Within 6 months, I was promoted to executive vice president and a member of the office of the president in charge of all risk management functions, HR, and everything else included. I mean, we had an esteemed board of directors, the former CEO at American Express, former vice chairman of IBM, former vice chairman at Morgan Stanley, a president of an Ivy League college. I mean, these people were the who's who of governing people. And I learned so much from them, had constant interaction with the board. I mean, I felt blessed by being engaged with people like this and what I was able to learn from them, and developed wonderful relationships with them. Along the way, the bank had some issues with the federal regulators. My friend was on the hot seat. I was the succession plan, but he knew he could trust me for not throwing him under the bus. And so I played dutifully that role to help support him and the bank, and we ultimately concluded by selling the bank in 2002. And so it was a wonderful experience, high level, engaged with people who were, you know, just some of the biggest names in business and people who I have just enormous respect and regard when I consider them. So, but now I got to go out and try something else on for size. So I've had, I started a subchapter S corporation in 2002, and luckily enough became engaged with numerous Fortune 500 and major financial institutions, a lot of work on helping them set up ethics and compliance programs, doing culture issues and so forth. I've been a broken record on culture for decades, and ultimately spoke often with enforcement authorities at DOJ, SEC, and elsewhere about the importance of culture. And I'd like to believe that in some small way. In fact, I'll tell you a story. So it's more than like to believe. So the ECOA is having a conference out in Arizona. It's right after Sarbanes-Oxley has passed. Sarbanes-Oxley asked the Federal Sentencing Commission to create an ad hoc committee to study changes in the federal sentencing guidelines so that it would be in alignment with Sarbanes-Oxley. Ed Petrie, who was then head of the ECOA, comes to me at this conference. Keith, I've just been appointed to this conference. Eric Holder, other luminaries are going to be on this. I mean, it was a big deal. He said, what are the top 3 things we should ask for? I said, Ed, it's simple. Culture, culture, culture. I mean, that's how powerful it is. Culture is by far the single biggest determinant of behavior in every organization in the world. Absolutely, unequivocally, bar none. It changes different cultures around the world. There are different influences to it, without question. But culture is preeminently important in managing behaviors in organizations. So, long story short, the revisions to the federal sentencing guidelines said tone at the top, ethics standards, and a culture of integrity. So now it finally became part of the law, what the enforcement authorities are looking for. With the Thompson memo, that was actually the first step that did that. And I've been talking to people at DOJ. So Larry Thompson in January of 2003 comes out with his now famous Thompson memo issued to all prosecutors across the U.S. Here's what you must consider before you prosecute a corporation: the seriousness of the offense, the pervasiveness of wrongdoing, a history of similar misconduct. There are about a dozen elements that he outlined for them. Go back to the word pervasive. The very first thing enforcement authorities look for when they come in to investigate: is this a rogue act by an individual or a small group, or is it pervasive, systemic, inculcated? Is it part of the culture of the organization? Is leadership willfully blind? This is what they look for. And I've had numerous conversations over the years with the Department of Justice about this. So they finally get it. And I'll come back to the DOJ in a minute as well. But this was a powerful time. Now all of a sudden this profession is emerging. Sarbanes-Oxley by itself was a bill about tone at the top. All right? They spoke to 3 audiences. They spoke to the accounting profession, created a regulator, which they never had. It was a self-regulated profession prior to that. Spoke to the governing authority, boards of directors, and spoke to senior executives. That's what Sarbanes-Oxley was all about. Most powerful piece of legislation since the Great Depression. So life goes on. We don't trust, because we had the tech bubble burst, so we don't trust stocks anymore. You know, there was a big fallout for NASDAQ in particular. NASDAQ went from 453 to 5,132 during the tech bubble, and then it fell to 1,100 in the summer of 2002. It lost 80% of its value. So we don't trust the markets anymore. But you have to invest. Smart investors have got to put their money someplace. So people were brilliant. They put it in real estate. So we created the real estate bubble of 2007, 2008. And you could see this coming. So having grown up in the banking business, here's what I was observing before the collapse in September of 2008. Banks were putting out teaser rates on mortgages. Okay, we will tease you into a mortgage. We'll give you a very low interest rate for 1.5 to 3 years, but after which it's going to revert to a market rate that you can't possibly afford, but we don't care because we're going to sell that risk into the secondary markets. They had no documentation loans that quickly became known as liar's loans. Listen to the language that we're talking about. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what's going on here. And then we created ninja loans for subprime borrowers. No job, no income, no assets. Everybody can get a mortgage. And then the underwriters would take these things and bundle them in units of $1 million in different tranches of risk. So AAA, AA, single A, triple B, double B, single B, and also subprime. And then they would sell this stuff off. This is a classic moral hazard, that the people who perpetrate the risk don't have the consequences of it. And so they sell this crap all over the world. I actually moved all of my assets into cash in September of 2017, which was a year before the crash. I thought there might have been a 20% correction. I couldn't have, 07. I couldn't have predicted what would have happened here. Yeah, 2007. I couldn't have predicted what happened here. I mean, this collapse was stunning. I mean, 21 million people lost their jobs worldwide. $34 trillion in global equities were lost. Beautiful brands that had been around for decades went out of business. I mean, it was horrific. And how we got through that process is just incredible. Nancy Pelosi convened a meeting in her office September 18th of 2008, and she had the senior leaders from the Senate and the House of Representatives and the regulators there. And Hank Paulson gets up and for 20 minutes addresses this group and basically says, if you don't give us wartime powers, the entire global banking system will disappear within a week. I just hold that thought for a second. Think about that. So he gets all done. She turns to Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, the considered genius about global depressions. She says, Mr. Chairman, what do you think? He said, if you don't act today, there will be no economy on Monday. And then Paulson goes out and writes a 3-page memo asking for $700 billion. I would have sent a 5-page memo and asked for more. I don't know. But, I mean, this was a horrific period of time. And just like the Enron era and collapse, and now the real estate collapse that takes place, in both cases, I naively thought that this was an opportunity for us to transform the way we conduct business. I honestly believed that this opportunity existed. How stupid. Within weeks, if not months at least, I kept hearing people around the world say, I can't wait to get back to business as usual. I was like, you got to be kidding me. I mean, this is just awful. So, but life goes on. I continued to be engaged with numerous organizations trying to help them through this mess. And then one day I got a call from my friend Gretchen Winter, and she said, how would you like to babysit the ECOA? Our existing executive director is going to step down. And calls the day after and said, would you possibly consider working for us full time? And I said, Gretchen, you probably can't afford me, but I know what you can afford. I'm just taking a guess. I'm intuitive. I said, why don't you do your national search, which they were doing, and it'll give us time to find out if we like each other, whether this makes sense. I said, the only thing that matters is the organization, so don't think about me in this process. Happy to help out in the meantime. So they come back and they say, you're the guy. And so I become executive director in May of 2005, if I got my dates right. And to me, it was transforming. I was told during the search process that the organization ran by itself. And of course, I got in the door and discovered very quickly it did not. The entire infrastructure was broken. The IT platform was broken. We didn't have policies and procedures and the things that one should have as a model for organizational governance. So we put all of that stuff in place. If you want a platform for growth, the platform has to be strong. So we did that. That was our first order of business. And then, as I told the board, even during the search process, there's a couple of things we have to think about here. As we get big, because our conferences were getting big, we have to stay small, meaning that we have to sponsor small group meetings in different locations. As we ask people to come to us, we have to find ways to go to them and use technology to deliver programs and so on and so forth. We wound up ultimately supporting 25 industry groups, actually 18 industry groups and 25 regional groups around the world. Through the ECOA, which I thought was terrific. We moved from 37 teaching days, conferences and the like, to 165 teaching days during this period of time. And in particular, we went from US-centric to global. And that actually happened after the Great Recession. So in January of 2009, I went to the board and I said, I'm not sure, given the economic circumstances that I'm looking at as somebody who's trained in economics, I don't know what the future holds in store for us. We were financially strong going into that period of time, so I felt great. But I said, I'm just not sure. As it turns out, the rest of the world needed us. All of a sudden, people awakened to all issues of corruption and everything else that these meltdowns expose. And so we had already built up some pretty significant relationships globally. So for example, at our conferences every year for 20 years, a group came over from the Korean Management Association. So I immediately reached out to Professor Young-Chul Chang, who was the lead of that group. He spoke English and Korean, so he was the translator for them and so forth. Got to know him. Chang says to me, there's somebody you have to bring here as a keynote speaker next year. I said, who's that? He said, K.H. Moon, Kyuk-Hun Moon. He's running for president of the Republic of Korea right now, but he will interrupt his schedule and come over. Everybody loves him. He's known as somebody promoting ethics and leadership and social responsibility, and has built enormous successes in his companies. He was president of Yuhan Kimberly in Korea, and president of Kimberly-Clark Asia, and had just quit his career to run for president. So he came over and gave a stunning presentation. I mean, everybody, he believes in lifelong learning. He is credited with planting 100 million trees in the aftermath of the Korean War, the reforestation of Korea, and so he is still one of my closest friends to this day. You know, we talk, we write each other, and so forth. A wonderful guy. He didn't win the presidency. He ran on an anti-corruption platform, but he's still been promoting things. He's on the board of the Drucker Institute at Claremont College. He promotes the Drucker principles everywhere around the world. Just one of the most devoted people to using business as a tool for the benefit of society. And so I got to meet him, and he's introduced me to so many other leaders in the area. And the Korean Management Association keeps going over there. I used to go over there and speak to corporations throughout Korea as a result of that. So we've had a wonderful relationship there. Then we had another group internationally that was part of the ECOA, and they came from the Philippines. And it was PLDT, the Philippine Long Distance Telephone Company, part of the MVP group. That was the holding company. And they used to send a delegation of about a dozen people every year. So they invited me to come over to the Philippines. And there were 9 people in a room. They sat down. They said, we're so inspired by the ECOA. We would like to form a group here. Would you mind if we called it the ECOA of the Philippines? I said, there could be some name confusion, but let's try something different. And so they said, okay, how about the Good Governance Advocates and Practitioners of the Philippines? I said, okay, if that's what you want, that's fine. And I'm happy to help you any way that I can. So from the U.S., I began to offer some support about things that they could do. And then a year later, they called me up. They said, would you come back? We'd like you to be the keynote speaker at the induction of our officers and trustees. I said I'd be thrilled. And so they had this group of about 300, the head of the SEC, the Supreme Court Justice head, et cetera. I mean, it was a big affair and so forth. And this thing has really grown. And what happened in the Philippines is that this ethics initiative under President Aquino really took off in a very, very big way. He supported anti-corruption initiatives in the government, including creation of ombudsmen, terminated people who were corrupt and embroiled in scandals and so forth. On the business side, they began to promote for the large cap companies governance principles, and I worked with the Institute of Directors over there to help define some of those principles as a first step. Worked with the Philippine Stock Exchange to also advise them on that. Did a lot of speaking to corporations over there. And the net result is during Aquino's one-term, 6-year term, because that's all you can run for, that they went from the Transparency International Index from 150 down to 89. I mean, this is like stunning. That for the first time they had bonds that were market rated. They hadn't had that before. There was an inflow of capital into the country, and the economy grew at 8% per year during his 6 years. And what it proved was what can happen when there are public-private partnerships. I was on an anti-corruption commission for the World Economic Forum. I went to the World Economic Forum. I said, you got to get President Aquino over here to keynote, talk about his successes doing this, and then also set up private meetings with other heads of state to talk about public-private partnerships and what can be accomplished. And they did that. They brought him over as a keynote speaker. So that was stunning. But we've had similar experiences. I helped set up a similar organization, ECOA, in Mexico City. Did the same thing in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. I was asked by the UN Global Compact to go over to Lagos, Nigeria, which was a little scary, to set up an organization there, which we did. I spent several days over there. Had an interesting exit plan going from there. So I get to the airport. I'm about to leave after spending a few days with about 100 executives. And the customs guard is there, and he asks my passport. And my passport in those days was inches thick. And so I give it to him. He doesn't look up. He's flipping through the pages. So what was your purpose of being here? And I see, by the way, 2 of his aides walk away. Now I know I'm going to be hit up for a bribe, right? I mean, you can see it coming. I was just like, am I going to do this, or what the hell am I going to do? So he's flipping through. He said, what are you doing here? I said, I'm here with the United Nations setting up anti-corruption initiatives. He doesn't look up. He keeps flipping through the pages. Would you repeat that, please, he says. I repeat it. Then he looks up with a big grin. He said, did anybody stay to listen to you? You can't make this up. In the airport, there were signs that said, bribery will not be tolerated here. In the hotel that I stayed at, it said money laundering will not be tolerated here. They have signs all over. You know, it'll be appropriate outside the door, but not inside the facility. I mean, it's just crazy. But so we did a lot of work there. Then we had somebody else who was from the Middle East, ran one of the chief ethics officer for one of the sovereign wealth funds in Abu Dhabi, and he called me up one day and he said, "Keith, we're trying to reduce our reliance on expatriates. Would you be open to considering bringing interns into the ECOA?" I said, "Absolutely." So next thing you know, we're taking interns in from the Middle East and training them how to be compliance executives and so forth, and began to develop what has now been a multi-year relationship with the government of Abu Dhabi. And so it's this internationalization of this. We then helped form, I became the founding chairman of the International Association of Compliance Organizations. Ireland, US, we were the US, South Africa, and Australia. And so we were collaborating, quarterly telephonic meetings and so forth to try and share best practices as membership organizations and so forth. But I mean, it was just, to that internationalization became very important. Of course, we've had partners in Europe for many, many years as well. So the combination of all of these things and seeing the world from a different angle of vision, hearing the issues from others, not just US-centric issues, but global issues and the concerns that people have and how can we help them, all became part of what we were trying to accomplish during this period of time. So I felt blessed and gifted. Along the way, my teaching career, I couldn't teach full-time courses anymore. So, but then Tom Donaldson, friend of Pat Werhane's, he goes up to Wharton and he calls me up. He said, "How would you like to teach in our exec ed programs?" And so since 1994, I've been teaching ethics and leadership and executive education at the Wharton School. So that still scratches my itch there. I had another teaching experience that was phenomenal. I got invited to teach in a master's program out in Seattle, Washington, Antioch University. It was a master's in organizational management. And I would fly out on a Friday morning, teach Friday evening, all day Saturday, half day Sunday, and take the red eye back to New York. And this would meet one weekend a month, and over the course of 3 weekends, you had enough course hours to earn 3 credits towards your master's degree. And then during the week and during the month, we would talk to each other online and pose case studies and so forth and have these raging dialogues. It was a little bit of a distance learning, you know, from an educator standpoint, and I really loved it. It was fabulous. But I had one experience with the group where I was asked to put on a leadership program on a tall ship, a 2-masted schooner that was a National Historic Monument, 101 feet long, out of Seattle Harbor. A group of 35 senior executives came together to go on this maiden voyage for this particular journey. We were effectively going to be the crew. There were about 3 professional crew members, but the rest of us were going to heave and hoe and do all that stuff. The captain comes out and he starts reading from Khalil Gibran the first day, and I'm like, oh boy, this is going to be interesting. I decided to pose a question just to break the ice and get everybody to know each other. What did you have to do to get ready for this trip? And we're going to be out for 10 days. Oh, I stuff at home, and we got issues, and I got somebody else. I'm all backed up in my work life, but I decided this was terribly important to me. One woman says, "I just can't wait to find myself." You know, there was one woman, a senior executive from Microsoft. She was totally agitated. "I don't have my pager. I don't have my beeper. I don't have my cell phone." She was so agitated. It was crazy. About 3.5 days later, we're out sailing through the San Juan Islands. She's standing by the side of the ship. I'm nearby, but I'm not. She's by herself. And we're looking, there's a pod of orcas breaching in the water, 17 of them. There are eagles flying overhead. And I hear her say to nobody, she said, "I've never felt so in touch with myself." We got to unplug. We have to unplug. We had the most extraordinary experience. I tried to use the natural elements of what we were experiencing for leadership dialogues, both morning and evening. We came to the conclusion that we were running on wind, water, and wood, the natural elements. That to be, safe, that you have to know the elements around you, the stars, the tides, everything. It's fathometers, that we only have each other. This is like the metaphor for the good ship Earth that we're sailing here. This was a totally transforming experience to me. And we got all done, and my host, who had invited me to do this thing, called me up a year later, and he said, hey, you ready? And I said, nope. This was an epiphany. You cannot recreate an experience like this. It was that transforming. So, and I still have great friends out in Seattle as a result of that. So, so life has gone on. I've been very blessed. You know, decided that when I left ECOA, I figured I'd hang a shingle for a few years. Maybe somebody would call me up to give a speech or, you know, write something. And almost immediately, my friends at Deloitte called up and said, would you join us as a subject matter expert? And I said, happily, because I've known the firm for 30 years. I helped them build their first ethics program. But I said, I don't want to work full time. So we came to an agreement. It was a very robust agreement. And so I've been an advisor to their clients now for 7 years. It's an annual contract. We renew it annually. In addition, I have my own clients, a couple of sovereign wealth funds, a few oil companies, and a major semiconductor company that I do some advisory work for. But it's been wonderful. And in the meantime, I'm getting a little bit of white space into my calendar. So I'm back writing. I've written a memoir. Not that anybody wants to read anything about me. Who the heck is Keith Darcy? But I gave it to an editor with the charge, tell me if there's a book here. And if there isn't, I wrote a book 3 years ago, and the sole audience was for my wife and 2 kids. It was called Lost and Found. And so I wrote about my life. In particular, I wanted my kids to see that out of hardship, out of dark times, like the photographer, we can turn negatives into positives. And I wanted my kids to see that. They kind of knew, but I wanted to at least document it. It also became a love letter to my wife, we're now together 50 years, because she stood behind me through thick and thin, through everything that we had to experience together. And they loved it. I mean, they all loved it. And Lost and Found is I once was lost, and now I'm found. Because in the journey through seminary in particular, you know, you could be a psychologist and say, was I looking for a father, an all-approving father of some kind? Or what I really experienced in that hole of the mountain was I found the greatest gift of all. I found me. And I could do anything I wanted. And I didn't have to be a banker just like Dad. And I had a passion for this field that I'd been involved in for so many years. So set out into the unknown. And boy, we've had the ups and downs. Had one Friday night, you know, for a couple of years while we had Joe Snyder's money. I did not draw on that because I was still getting paid by the bank. And then finally I had to draw on my own resources. Actually ran up $100,000 in debt, extended credit cards to the max, didn't have enough money to pay the next bill. One Friday night I'm writing bills out at my desk. I've got $4,000 more in bills than I have access to cash. I have no money in the bank, credit cards maxed out. I have $16,000 in accounts receivable, though, due the next month. All right, I put the pen down. The phone rings. It's an attorney friend of mine, George O'Kelly. Hey, Keith, it's George. Hey, George, how you doing? He said, I don't know why I did this. I just got a finder's fee on a big case and so forth, but I stuck a check in the mail for $5,000 and sent it to you. Pay me back next year or the year after. I paid him back next month. But, you know, if you want to feel a divine moment, a spiritual moment, and my life has been blessed that way. I've really looked at this as a spiritual journey. And I think we need to get back to some understanding of the spirit, however one defines that. I think there's too much focus today on money and the economy and the material things, and not enough on the things that are important in life. And so what I'm trying to do is concentrate more and more in my work, not just on ethics and compliance and how do you construct the governance processes for this and the right policies. And yeah, that's been a big part of what I've been going through, but I'm now impressed that we're beginning to, in earnest, talk about the social responsibility of business. And we've had this conversation frequently over the last 20 or more years, but it's never gone anywhere. It's become a big PR thing for many corporations. But I think in earnest now, because we have Larry Fink from BlackRock, who has issued his Purpose and Profits paper, and basically what he's saying is governments cannot do anything. They are paralyzed right now worldwide, and that we as corporate leaders have the capacity and need to step up in order to create change for society, for the good. And climate change is one of the issues, obviously, it's huge on. But the World Economic Forum has also dedicated last month's meeting to social capitalism. The Business Roundtable, although I think they were running away from some of the political noise about, you know, going after big business and so forth, but they've come out and said that stakeholder theory, Ed Freeman's stakeholder theory, is now in vogue, that shareholder primacy is not. And so I do think there's a chance now for social responsibility to take on some clarity, some honest initiatives. I think it'll go in fits and starts like it always has. A lot of people don't understand it. They view it as public relations and so forth. But this one has a chance to take deep roots. So my next book is going to be more in that space than writing about all the scandals and all the great companies and so forth. I think there's an interesting history to social responsibility, and I've been a nut about this stuff. I save everything, so I've got tons of information on this going back decades. So see if I can pull it together. But it's been a heck of a journey.
That's wonderful. I feel like applauding.
Yeah, it's no, you couldn't imagine that I'd be in this space. I just couldn't imagine it. It just, yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Really appreciate it.
No, it's out of the pain of the first family experiences, and it was painful to be able to realize something at this unthinkable. But I've always held true to my principles. My family, there was a lot of money, and it was corrupt, and uncles trying to screw each other, and sons screwing their fathers and everything else. I got de-willed by my grandmother and my father because they didn't like the girl I brought home to marry, and I said, so long, just keep walking, because I found the love of my life, and nobody was going to take that away from me. And so, I'd love to tell you how easy it was. Of course, they're never easy. And they're never easy like that. No, it wasn't. It was very painful. But
as you look forward, Keith, you talked about social responsibility. You talked about these changes that you can see immediately on the horizon. As you look forward, think about your grandchildren. You adore them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful, beautiful relationship. As you think about the future for ethics compliance, for the way business gets run, the way government and business interact, do you have any predictions, any future advice?
Yeah, I go back to Gen X and Gen Y as being activists. I look at my son, and he is a very morally grounded kid who wants to see society change for the better, and will actively engage in certain initiatives in that regard. And so, and if he's any indication, and I think he is, because we know all of his friends, they've been lifelong friends, you can see there's this desire. Now what we need is, we need an ideal, and we need somebody to be able to address that ideal. You need somebody who's a visionary. You needed a Martin Luther King to coalesce the civil rights movement. Obama, for reasons, he also offered us hope in that. But we don't have that person today, unfortunately, right now. I look at my daughter after 9/11, and my brother died in the Trade Center, went down with it. I had a front row seat that was right there. I watched the second jet fly across the Hudson, go into the South Tower. So I lived that firsthand. But my daughter, as soon as that happened, she and her husband went into the intelligence community and lived over in the Middle East, and did their service to the country, and a very big service. What little I know and can assume, but now she's out of service. Her oldest is 15, and he has tree nut and peanut allergies, very serious. So she's become a recognized expert and advocate in this field, and goes to Capitol Hill all the time. She's on TV all the time, and it's just, she's got a big following on this. And so she's out there promoting and trying to make this a better place. And so I look at these kids, and they're out there.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I'm just so proud of them. It's
they had a good role model.
yeah, well, it's their mother has been terrific. Yes.
I'm going to say it's both of you.
Yeah. And my wife's been the school teacher, and the greatest gift of my life. We met 50 years ago last September. We'll be married 47 years this June, and just
Congratulations.
my college sweetheart. Every night's date night. It's just, yeah, she's,
Wonderful customers.
yeah, it's. But I've been very blessed. Her support, my wife's support, is just, you can't say enough about it. Every stupid decision I ever made, she's been right there behind me, and that's, yeah, it's very funny. But
It's been a good life.
and it's been a great life, seriously,
You've
and.
got more to do.
And yeah, but it is a life of
Like you're slowing
gratitude.
down for a
No, it doesn't.
I don't
sound
know
like
how
it at
to.
all.
I don't know how
You
to,
don't have a
Pat.
rocking chair yet.
No, not at all.
I don't think
I
you're, no, I think they're gonna skip that.
I can't do it. I just, they're going to carry me out in the body bag, but when I'm finished. But I'm not finished yet, so.
No, of course not.
And the beauty of this field, and this is really important, is that we meet some of the greatest people that I've ever met in my life. Some of my best friends have emerged in my ethics career. And I feel so blessed by that, because there's something that holds us together. And it's called trust. We inherently trust each other. We know each other, you know? It's just we're all dedicated to trying to make this place a little bit better. And what greater blessing can there be than having people like that, you know? And we're all in touch with each other. You stay in touch. You know, if I don't see Gretchen for 5 years, we'll pick up the phone tomorrow, and it's pick up on the last conversation, right?
It's true.
It's just, that's who we are.